All right, we are going to get started. First of all, a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today. A few logistics notes before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and the materials as well as the recording will be shared later on this week. During the webinar, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. We'll leave plenty of time at the end to answer questions, so feel free at any point during the presentation to jot your questions down. Anything and everything is fair game, and like I said, we will leave plenty of time to go through the questions at the end. A quick introduction on today's speakers. My name is Eleni Polikrignadou, and I'm the Commercial Director at Sintali. Sintali and SGS collaborate to act as an Edge global certification provider for IFC. And today I'm joined by Harry Fernau, the Global Product Manager for Energy and Green Building at SGS.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Harry. Today we are going to cover quite an interesting and big topic, and it's about thinking beyond individual buildings and implementing Edge at scale. Now, needless to say, this is a very big question, and we won't be able to cover absolutely everything, but we're aiming to give you a good overview and understanding of the topic and hoping to help you answer several key questions today. Why do we need to think beyond individual buildings? Why hasn't it been achieved yet? Why is Edge suited to make it a reality? And how do you actually implement Edge at scale? You ready? Let's dive in. So the first question is, why do we need scale in the first place? Now, the world is warming at a pace that's faster than we ever could have imagined, and the race is on to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. Back in October of 2018, the IPCC put out a report that stated that to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, we need to keep warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, what that means is halving our global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which is now just 9 years away, and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The good news is loads of commitments have been made to date by governments and corporates. I think the most notable one recently was China, at the end of last year, committing to reach net zero emissions by 2040. And we're hoping that next week, as the new president in the US is sworn in, he will rejoin the Paris Climate Treaty, all of which bring us closer to this target of 1.5 degrees. But as you can see in front of you, that's still not enough, because even with the current targets, the current policies, the current pledges, and an element of optimism, we're still at 2.1 degrees of warming. And while that difference doesn't seem huge, that half a degree actually makes a significant difference for every person on this planet. Now, when we think about the key culprits, if you will, of the greenhouse emission problem, typically polluting sectors might be energy and transportation, and buildings may not be on top of mind. But buildings actually have a significant impact on the environment. So today's buildings generate 19% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions and consume 40% of electricity globally. And that's just the actual buildings. There's also the emissions of all the construction materials that are used. The cement sector alone contributes 3% to global greenhouse gas emissions. So all of that adds up and makes the building sector quite significant for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the problem is that all of this is set to increase in impact if we continue with current building practices because of urbanization and larger portions of the population moving into cities and pressuring energy demand and construction demands. So it would be fair to say we have a lot of work ahead of us. Now, the problem up until now has been that the industry standard has been looking at buildings on an individual level. So we would have one green office here, one green apartment block there, one green shopping mall. But we have this large goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We're now in 2021, and at this pace, we simply won't meet the target. And it's simple maths. If we take the average carbon footprint of a home built on site, and in this case, I'm looking at UK statistics. So if we take this average carbon footprint to be 65 tons of carbon, and consider that an average retrofit project from the point of initial discussion to completion could take 1 to 2 years. Now, consider how many buildings there are on this planet. If we look at those timeframes and those impact matrix, then I don't need to tell you the obvious, but it just doesn't add up. We can't get there in time if we spend the resources thinking about the impact of the built environment one building at a time. So if we know we need to implement green buildings at scale, why haven't we done it before? Well, green buildings in and of themselves are not new, but they are very rarely implemented at scale. And historically, there's been 4 reasons why that's the case. The time needed to implement green buildings, the money needed to roll them out at scale, the incentives to do it, and also the lack of precedent. Now, my guess is none of these concerns are a surprise to you. But the good news is, EDGE changes everything. EDGE completely changes the game of implementing green buildings at scale for several reasons, but largely because it addresses all 4 of those concerns. Now, the EDGE app, in and of itself, the functionality that it provides really helps to implement green buildings at scale because of things like replicability, because of functionality within the application, like the building multiplier save as functionality. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, that is a technical detail. But all of the things that sit behind the EDGE application allow for scale because it allows the user to find efficiencies of scale and really reduces the workload needed for each assessment. And that's on top of the fact that EDGE is the first truly global green building certification program that genuinely allows companies to assess each and every type of building in their portfolio and scale it across sites in every country around the world in a comparable, quantifiable, and scalable way. Now, that is something completely new on the market, but is a really key component for being able to look at implementing EDGE at scale. But let's take a look at each of the 4 concerns and look at how EDGE changes the game. The first one is time. Now, as we mentioned, the functionalities of EDGE, and granted this is paired with the unique Sintali-SGS portfolio process, which we will talk to you about a little bit later on in today's presentation, make the time needed to roll out EDGE across hundreds or thousands of buildings actually attainable. Now, imagine the time it takes to assess one building on EDGE. You need time to learn the application, understand what kind of documentation you need, undertake the self-assessment, talk with the auditor, answer questions, etc. Without a portfolio process, to certify 100 buildings would be the effort of 1 building times 100. And needless to say, that doesn't quite fit on our page, but you can imagine how much effort that is, and you're probably thinking, not interested. But with the Sintali-SGS approach and with the EDGE functionality, that changes dramatically. Once you group together buildings and create a portfolio of 100 buildings that can be assessed and undergo the EDGE certification process, it becomes much more scalable and manageable. And you find efficiencies of scale and time savings that suddenly those 100 buildings are not only attainable, but happily doable. But it's not just the time that is needed to implement EDGE at scale. It's also the money needed to either develop these green buildings or to retrofit these buildings. And the difficulty with accessing money for green buildings is a vicious cycle. So a company typically needs investment, but single buildings don't make sense for investors. And so there is less finance in the green building sector, which makes companies less likely to invest in green buildings, hence continuing this feedback loop of a lack of investment in green buildings. And if we step into the shoes of a bank or a fund, it kind of makes sense. Imagine you're a bank and you're looking at these two projects on your screen. On the left-hand side is a retrofit for a single building, which generates around 160 tons per year of carbon savings and needs approximately 5 million in financing. On the other hand, you have an 100 megawatt solar PV plant, and you can get much higher carbon savings for your ESG reports, and the deal size makes the effort worth it. And that's really what this is about, because to be able to, for an investor to be able to channel funds into a project, it takes a lot of effort from their side. They need to do the due diligence. They need to understand what the impact of the project is, what the credit worthiness of the company is, etc., etc., etc. And if you add all those costs together, 5 million just doesn't make sense. Whereas 75 million is suddenly justifying the effort needed to finance this project. So in this case, it's not a tough choice to understand what the investor will pick. But when you aggregate buildings and you put together a portfolio of buildings, the story changes. Now, the investor is looking at the same solar PV plant, but comparing it with a portfolio of, say, 50 warehouses. Whilst individually, the retrofit wouldn't cost very much, together, the loan comes out to approximately 100 million, and the CO2 savings have increased significantly. Now, up until now, we haven't seen much aggregation in the sector, and so the money wasn't typically there. But as more and more companies are looking at green buildings on a portfolio level, they are triggering more interest in the sector from the investment community. And because Edge makes scale more plausible, this is really creating much more demand. And as companies go to investors with these projects, investors become more keen to get involved in the sector. This interest is also partly driven by IFC's work with the investment community as a whole. Now, IFC does a lot of work to educate the investment community on the benefits of investing in green real estate and helps them set up incentive programs. For any of you working within Edge, you'll be very familiar with the Edge website that has a great list of financial incentives that already exist for Edge certified projects. But in many cases for portfolio opportunities, it's on the company to reach out to financial institutions directly and introduce them to an aggregation or a portfolio opportunity to really stimulate the market by presenting financiers with an easy opportunity to get involved in the green building space. And we have many clients around the world who have done this and have successfully accessed finance. So it's not a hypothetical, it's an actual possibility. And it's only going to continue to grow as an opportunity, particularly as more regulation shifts towards supporting this transition to net zero. So there are already government incentives in place to help catalyze the green building market. And at some point, it's likely that we're going to see a shift, that instead of governments incentivizing green, they start penalizing gray or brown buildings. So it's a really good time to get involved now to use this momentum within the financial community and the government community and access these incentives and benefits before the tables turn and it becomes more about deterring bad behavior as opposed to promoting and incentivizing this transition to green. Now, the final obstacle we mentioned as to why it hasn't been done to date was that there was no precedent for companies looking at scale. Well, today I can stand here and tell you that's not true anymore. There are companies on every continent around the world that are implementing Edge at scale, from industrial properties, to retail, to residential, to student housing, to social housing. We'll go into some of these examples in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation, but the argument that companies aren't doing this simply isn't true anymore.
Now, we've talked about why we must implement green buildings at scale, why it hasn't been done to date, or only few companies are doing it already, and why Edge is already changing the narrative. Now, let's focus on how to do it, how to shift with Edge a portfolio towards zero carbon. First of all, it's important to differentiate between looking at a portfolio of existing buildings and looking at the portfolio of new buildings or new building designs, right? Which could be a portfolio of new developments or a specific building design which a developer replicates. Now, while there are key differences between how to approach these two portfolio types, there's some underlying principles. Evaluate, implement, and plan. Now, evaluating, where do you stand? What is the current situation? And just as an example here, you can use the Edge application to look at your existing portfolio, evaluate very quickly the current status of your portfolio efficiency throughout either building types or geographies or within your company's business structure, right? And look at the current status of compliance with Edge. You might have a couple of buildings which are already Edge compliant. You might have a few buildings which are already at the level of Edge Advanced, which is the second tier, which is also zero carbon ready. And you might have a bunch of buildings which are not compliant yet. So that simply gives you the overview of what is the current status. Now, if you look at this from a portfolio perspective, the next question is, how do I improve? Thus, the next phase of implement, or the next part of implement, becomes very important because the Edge application allows you to play around with scenarios. It allows you to look at your portfolio parts, whether you look at them on a regional perspective or on a building type perspective or on a compliance perspective, and play around with different types of improvement measures. So you can use the Edge application to simply look at what if I were to implement LED lights across my whole portfolio, here, for example, reflective paint or whatever, and the application itself gives you immediately information on what would it cost, how much would I save, and what would be a return of investment. Having this in mind and thinking of your portfolio, it brings a second value for you. It reduces the cost of implementation. So imagine you want to implement LED lights for one building. It costs you X amount, right? Now, if you're using the Edge application to look at LED light implementation throughout your portfolio of 100 buildings, it's a different negotiating point with contractors or construction companies to bring them a bigger volume business, which reduces the cost for you. That's a second point you can add in there when thinking of scale. Now, what is also very important is to plan. prepare a strategy. When you've evaluated and you know your status, you know the rough potentials, the high level return of investment implementation measures, it's important to plan in terms of how to implement them and define milestones, and to plan for the future for any new designs, right? To look at how do I keep on growing. As the company grows, your building portfolio will grow or change, right? On the other hand, new buildings or developers or companies who are adding buildings to their portfolio can use the Edge application to define standard design, define standard designs for their design team, or to use the application to give standard requirements for their building contractors to meet a certain level of construction. Now, the idea of having a plan also gives the opportunity to certify milestones. So when you started evaluating at the very beginning, which is actually already the first milestone, having evaluated your portfolio, there is a portion of certifiable, most likely a portion of certifiable assets already. Use this to certify what you already have in order to take advantage of financing, of governmental incentives, what Eleni mentioned before. Take milestones in between to certify higher portion of your portfolio to show your markets that you are successful in your implementation. Take the certificates to attract further investments. Take the certificates you get to increase your sustainability rating of your company. Now, to summarize, or if we were to summarize the process, for existing buildings, you can use Edge to evaluate the current state of your portfolio very quickly online. You certify the portion that is compliant, and then use the data from the application to prepare a refurbishment strategy and certify milestones as the footprint of your portfolio improves. Now, for new buildings, you can use Edge as a design tool to standardize your design, to prepare guidance for your contractors. And in this case, you can also use the preliminary certification, which is the design certification, to prove that the design meets Edge criteria. And then in the rollout of your construction, you can use batch certification as new properties are constructed against this preliminary certified design. Now, to explain a bit who SGS Sintali or Sintali-SGS is, we help clients to achieve and to start and roll out this process through our approach of being a one-stop shop. So what we do is SGS is one of the, or is the biggest auditing, inspection, certification company in the world with over 94,000 employees. And we are the auditing company within the consortium Sintali-SGS. SGS is certifier, global certifier, and is certifying globally. Together, we've developed an Edge expert network, which we offer to our clients for a specific defined scope of work without any additional costs, but allows every client to really take advantage of getting help during the evaluation phase, getting help to prepare strategies and play around with different scenarios in using the Edge application, and of course helping during the certification process. It's a bit related also to what Eleni said before, the time issue, right? We're using, and that's, you know, a bit of an explanation, how do we help to scale? We're using innovation, which is mainly driven within SGS Group by the fact that we are the biggest auditing and inspection company. So we have to innovate as market leaders to quickly and efficiently scale audits and inspections. And within our all-in approach, which allows us to, use the experience we are gaining, we are very fast at rolling out global portfolios using the green building experience of SGS and Sintali, and of course the experience of our Edge Expert Partnership Network. Now, to give you just a couple of examples of what I mean by innovation, we're focusing on process, streamlining, and making sure that the audit and certification process is in line with your rollout or is in line with your specific portfolio. We are using and taking advantage of technology solutions, which we have developed in SGS Group, like our remote auditing application, SGS QIIQ, and standardized processes throughout the globe. For example, by having implemented a remote site audit mobile phone application, which further emphasizes the team efforts of having Edge Expert partners, clients, and SGS and Sintali working together. Now, our all-in approach brings multiple benefits to the portfolio approach. Because you're working with the same certifier and auditor, as explained before, lessons learned can be applied to entire portfolio, as opposed to having to learn from the buildings from the beginning every time. We also present our Edge Expert network to our partners, and they can really help as a significant support throughout the whole process, from technical questions, from trainings of your team, to resource planning, to playing around and giving you specific scenarios, helping you maybe to procure several or equipment in local markets, and helping you to certify your milestones. So working with the same team also means that you have a flexibility for changes. Within the next 5 to 10 years, your portfolio of buildings will change. Your company strategy will change. You need a flexible approach to address those changes. You might go into a different sector in your business, thus requiring different buildings. You might grow in a specific sector faster than you may grow in another sector. So it's important to have one team helping you throughout the years, keeping the experiences and being able to help you to achieve your goals.
Thanks, Harry. So I think we're going to dive into some real life examples now and kind of give you a sense of what portfolios look like, because the reality is there's no one specific type of portfolio, one specific characteristic. As Harry mentioned, every company is different, every company's journey is different, and so similarly, every portfolio looks a little bit different. We've talked a little bit about the difference between existing building portfolios and new development portfolios. So we'll start with a couple of examples of existing buildings, and then we'll give you examples of new portfolios. So the first we're going to look at is Little Lithuania. And Little Lithuania was actually one of the first companies to implement Edge at scale back in 2018, rolling out the Green Building Certification Scheme across 36 properties. Now, Little Lithuania as a portfolio was very interesting and an ideal candidate, if you will, because there was a lot of replicability within the portfolio. So because in retail, particularly for supermarkets, there's quite a standardization of designs, we were able to identify efficiencies of scale through the standardization and hence implement a sampling approach, which we agreed with IFC, which allowed us to really scale this project and actually complete the entire project within 6 months. Now, anybody that's worked on other green building standards might be thinking, 6 months to certify 36 buildings? That's quick. And yes, it is quick. But that's the beauty of Edge. And that's such an important selling point when, if you're a consultant, you're talking to your clients, or if you're within a company and you're talking to your fellow colleagues or the decision makers within your company. This is a really important element of Edge. When we're talking about implementing Edge at scale, we're not necessarily talking about 50-year-long projects. We're talking about projects that can be implemented in fairly normal, if not quick, timeframes. And the long-term element of a portfolio project is the improvement. So for example, you could be looking at certifying your milestones, as we mentioned, getting that Edge certification for the 20%, and then having a more long-term project to say, in the next 2 or 3 years, I'm going to move my portfolio to Edge Advanced, or I'm going to move my portfolio to zero carbon. Now, because that involves improvements and more long-term planning, that becomes a more long-term project. But the actual certification and audit process is fairly quick. Now, with the case of Little Lithuania, the key drivers as to why they went for certification at scale was to access financing, as well as to support the company commitment to sustainability. Because for Lidl, it was really important that they were bringing the value and the savings to their customers. And so all the operational savings they were able to capture by having resource efficient buildings were able to go directly to their customers through the pricing models that they've implemented. Another case study of an existing portfolio is WDP in Romania. Now, WDP is a very large warehouse company, and they certified over 45 warehouses in Romania, again within the 6-month timeframe. Now, this project was completed alongside one of our Edge expert partners, Build Green. Build Green was super involved in this particular project. They helped the client assess all the buildings and did a lot of work in preparing the documentation and really working with us on the process flow. So in this particular case, we were working primarily with the Edge expert partner and really developing that resource plan together and the process flow to help the client meet quite a difficult deadline. So again, the entire certification was completed within 6 months. And in this case, the time frame was super important because there was financing attached to it. So WDP was able to secure a 200 million loan from IFC, as well as an 150 million euro loan from EBRD. And both of these loans weren't necessarily financing entirely the refurbishment, but rather they were using the fact that Edge was being implemented and that there was this resource efficiency element to their warehouses, and including some of that loan for the refurbishment, and then other parts of the loan being used for expansion into Romania. And so we're seeing this a lot with financiers around the world, where the financing is partly for making sure that projects are meeting sustainability goals, but also looking more holistically at how they might be creating green jobs through such a program, and really helping the company to grow and meet climate mitigation targets. Now, this particular portfolio was a little different than Lidl because there wasn't the same level of standardization. So warehouses in some cases can be the same, but in some cases can be very different, and it can often depend on the tenant in terms of the energy use and consumption profile. So in this case, we didn't have the same sampling approach as we had for Lidl, but because we had the all-in approach, and because we were able to work with the same team and develop an efficient process, we were still able to realize significant savings for the client, and again, deliver within the set time frame, which was absolutely critical for the client, because if they didn't, they wouldn't get this financing. Now, for WDP, obviously the financing was a huge driver to move forward with the EDGE certification, but it also fit with the company's broader commitment to sustainability and the value that they bring to their clients, which is to provide efficient spaces, because that is a key selling point as they bring in tenants to their warehouses. Now, if we shift gears and move towards new developments, we have quite a few case studies around the world with companies that implement EDGE at scale and roll it out across a portfolio of buildings. One of these is Imperial Homes in the Philippines. Now, Imperial Homes committed to certifying over 2,000 residential units in 3 years. And we worked with them very closely. This project is still in the works, with a few of the typologies certified and a few still in the works. But the way that we structured this portfolio and the way that we were able to help Imperial Homes scale was focusing on the standardization of design types. And that comes back to what Harry was saying when we were looking at the differences between existing portfolios and new portfolios. And this is the benefit of using EDGE for new portfolios, is using the EDGE application to standardize the design types, to know how these buildings will be built and what kind of efficiency savings they will have, and then roll it out across different sites. So in this case, we had 5 design types, 5 different sites, and looked at different construction phases. So similarly to what Harry was saying, this batch certification. And so we went through a preliminary certification process, certifying all the design types. And now, as the buildings are being constructed across the different sites, we're certifying them in construction phases. And that's been really effective for Imperial Homes and really important to their broader mission of sustainability and bringing solar-powered and resilient communities to different communities within the Philippines. It's really supported their brand value, and it's something that has been quite core to the company's mission, and that's been really the key driver for Imperial Homes. So stay tuned. So hopefully by the end of next year, we'll have our final certified 2,267 units in the Philippines. But it's been a great project and a structure that works for a lot of residential developers who are looking to roll out units across multiple sites in a country or in multiple countries, depending on the developer. Now, if we shift to a different continent and go down to Colombia, we have seen a developer, Bolivar, implement EDGE at scale for social housing. Now, social housing is a huge topic around the world, and everybody is looking at ways to implement affordable and sustainable housing. And Bolivar is actually doing it. So Bolivar has taken an approach where they're registering a pipeline of projects. And these are really large projects, and there's a lot of standardization within each development, but not necessarily between the developments. So for example, Bolivar might have a large residential social housing development with a couple thousand units and one typology. So there's a lot of standardization there, but then that development won't be the same as the one they roll out at a different site. We can still find efficiencies of scale and help companies like that roll out Edge across all their properties. Now, in the case of Bolivar, they've registered over 38 social housing projects in the last 2 years, which is approximately 20,000 units that will be certified across different cities around Colombia. It's really impressive and really showing Bolivar's commitment to sustainability and their commitment to generate value for their clients. Because at the end of the day, what Edge is doing is bringing those savings to the homeowners. And that is so important and really addressing a vulnerable need. Now, the way that we've worked with Bolivar in this case is finding the efficiencies of scale by working with the same team and the same company, and really looking at the specific projects and finding how we can find the savings on a project by project level to allow them to have these 38 projects through Edge. So as you can see, we have quite a wide variety of experience and every portfolio is different. But the underlying message is that we work with each of these companies, we look at ways to find efficiencies of scale, and we help make them make scale possible. It's no longer a pipe dream, but actually a reality and something that is both resource efficient and time efficient and possible and brings benefits to multiple stakeholders within the broader network. Now, before we wrap up and open up for questions, I just want to do a quick summary because we've covered a lot of ground in 45 minutes. First of all, we looked at why we need to scale. And we showed you that to truly address climate change, we need to think much bigger than an individual building by individual basis. We showed you that through scale, portfolio projects are able to access green financing to support broader sustainability efforts. We reviewed the 4 key reasons why scale hasn't been implemented to date: time, money, incentives, and precedent, and why Edge addresses all of those areas. And finally, we looked at how Sintali-SGS helps companies implement at scale alongside our network of Edge experts, and showed you how through our one-stop shop approach, we allow each stakeholder in the process to focus on what they do best and really streamline Edge certification. So for Sintali-SGS, that means we focus on developing the portfolio approach that makes most sense for the project, as well as auditing and certifying the entire portfolio of buildings. For the Edge expert, that means preparing the assessments, advising on the strategy, and guiding the process forward to complete the Edge certification. For the client, that means focusing on delivering the documentation needed, finalizing strategic plans, and presenting this data to financial institutions to access financing. And for banks, that means using this entire process to understand the project, provide the financing, and reporting on sustainable investments. So truly a win-win for everybody involved to focus on the specific areas that make most sense for each stakeholder to really streamline the process and make implementing Edge at scale a reality. Now, while there are many commonalities, at the end of the day, every portfolio is unique. So if you would like to discuss in more detail a specific portfolio opportunity, please do reach out to us. The email is edge@sintali.com, and it'll come to both me and Harry. So please do feel free to reach out with specific questions. But we now have around 15 minutes to go through the questions being submitted. If you've had any other questions come up during this time, please continue to use the Q&A feature, and we will be happy to answer them as we go along now. So let me open up the questions and answers. Okay, so the first question, and I'll throw this to Harry to start with, is do the buildings have to be relatively similar for this process to work?
It's a very good question, right? So also a bit referring to the examples Eleni has shown, we're really looking at every portfolio, separately. Now, what we do see, of course, is the more design similarities a portfolio has, the quicker and easier is the certification process as such. What we also see is the more design similarities a portfolio has, the easier it is to get implementation plans in place, right? But on the other hand, we see that for different types, like the warehouse portfolio from WDP, or like Grupo Bolivar in Colombia, looking at portfolio does not require design similarities. It is important that you look at all your buildings. Whether they are design similarities or not, you can always look at separately. But even if they are not, and thinking of shopping centers, for example, right? A client with 35 shopping centers, they might all look completely different. But it doesn't mean that the process cannot be efficient for 35 shopping centers, right? So no, it does not require design similarities. It just makes it slightly easier if there is.
Absolutely. And I think the examples that we showed of the different types of portfolios kind of covered that, because we approached each of them differently, and were still able to find efficiencies of scale, regardless of whether they were similarities or not. And that kind of comes back to what we had presented earlier in terms of the big focus on process. And I think, process is something that doesn't sound super exciting, but is so important for going through this green building certification. And you can really streamline and find ways to save time and money for clients by just having a good process. And so there's a big emphasis on that from our side. And that's really why we make it work, whether the buildings are similar or not. There's another question here about how the audit works if projects are in different countries. Sorry, Harry, another one for you.
That's also, it's a very good question. So, SGS is set up in a way. We have over 2,000 offices and laboratories across the world. Our edge auditor team is spread out across the globe in competence and execution centers, right? So we have local auditors in every region, focusing on languages, on time differences, on markets. And what we are more and more trying to do, specifically, if you think of the year 2020, is to implement remote audit solutions. I've mentioned two types before, like QIIQ software and our mobile phone application, which allows us to do audits very quickly and sometimes even upon request or upon a call, based on construction progress. And our execution or competence centers would carry them out, either personally or remotely. So this is how the audit process works. Of course, the design audit doesn't require an on-site visit because it looks at documentation, but the on-site audit does require an on-site visit, and our company has implemented, and luckily we had that for over 2 years actually, remote audit solutions, which allowed us in the year 2020 to also audit portfolio projects across the world, even with travel restrictions, and without risking our auditors' health, to be honest,
Health
and our clients' health.
And that kind of ties into a couple of questions around the role of edge experts, whether SGS hires external edge experts, and what the process is of becoming an edge expert. So I can cover these, but in terms of becoming an edge expert, the process is you have to take an edge expert training. You can find that on the Sintali.com website. We have a list of different trainings you can take. These are offered live stream, particularly as we're all currently still locked down due to COVID. And once you take your 8-hour training, you can then go through and take the edge exam. Once you pass the edge exam, you become accredited from IFC as an edge expert. Sintali-SGS works with edge experts as partners. So we don't hire edge experts as auditors because SGS is doing all of this auditing, as Harry mentioned, but we do work with edge experts in a variety of different ways. So through our partnership, we have a standard offer where a standard scope of work is included for our smaller projects. For portfolio projects, we might do more bespoke edge expert offer within the offer. We might work with edge experts when we need remote site audit support. So having an edge expert be on site if they're based locally. We have edge expert trainings, we have train the trainers. So we have a full edge expert partnership program, and you can find more details on our website, and be happy to work with you if you continue to move forward in the edge expert route. Another question, and I think Harry, you and I will maybe tag team this one, but there is a specific example of a company that has followed some of the standards that we've talked about and has constructed a very efficient building. And it's now about a year after the completion of construction. Can we give examples of how a company that already has an existing building can take advantage of edge certifying an existing building?
Yes, I mean, the term existing building, on the one hand, means that the building is existing. So it's finished construction, right? Now, within the EDGE certification scheme, any type of building can be certified, right? The term existing building within the EDGE application means older than 5 years, right? Any building can be certified, whether it's constructed today or it has been constructed last year or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? So what you would always do in terms of an existing building, you may not need a design certification, so a preliminary certification, because your building is existing already, right? Even if it's only 1 year old, you would go directly to a final certification, but you would still look at design documentation. You would use the EDGE application to, describe your building and your building data. You would upload evidence documentation, and we would do a review of the documentation uploaded, but then go directly to a site audit, allowing for a direct final certificate to be issued once, of course, the audit process was successful.
And there's a couple of key benefits of going for certification, even if your building has been already built. So on the one side, there's a lot of importance being put right now in the market to verify your sustainability achievements. Because unfortunately, there are many people that stand up and say, I have a green building, or I have done sustainability, and then upon further scrutiny, there's either false claims or exaggerating the actual impact. And so having a certificate that validates your achievements is really important in terms of building credibility with your stakeholders, whether that's your direct customers, your investment board, broader investment community. It's very powerful to have that particular certificate. And if you are going for financing to potentially either renovate or to do a different expansion, that certificate is going to be needed by an investor, again, to verify your achievements. The other advantage of going for EDGE certification on existing building is that you can start to move to EDGE Zero Carbon. We talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but ultimately regulation is going to require that all new buildings are zero carbon by 2030 and existing buildings are zero carbon by 2050. So you have two options. You can wait until it becomes mandatory regulation and then scramble to make it happen, or you can start transitioning your building stock to meet this net zero requirement. And so you can use the EDGE certification on your existing building to get yourself as close to zero carbon as possible. So that would be at least an EDGE advanced certificate, so 40% more energy efficiency of the building. And then if you are ready for zero carbon, so the building's been in operation for a year, you have the operational data, then you can look at on-site, off-site renewable energy, procuring green energy, and ultimately offsetting any remaining emissions. So there's a lot of value and ways to take advantage of EDGE, whether your project is existing or whether you haven't designed it yet. Question for you, Harry. What are the limitations of remote audits versus on-site audits?
Yes. The limitations are internet availability. That's a short answer. So in order to do an on-site audit, it basically means that someone needs to be on site with either a mobile phone or Google glasses, or we're even doing drone inspections, right? But this requires an internet access at certain points during the inspection time. When we look at portfolio inspections together with our partners, with our EDGE expert partners, which help clients also during the on-site, or can help also during the on-site remote inspections, we are very experienced with these partners, and they use our mobile phone app, which works offline, so without an internet connection. And they check in with the SGS auditor during the inspection when they have internet access. So we have two types of remote audits. The first one is where the EDGE auditor is constantly present during the whole audit, during the whole remote audit. This requires constant internet connection. And for portfolio certifications or for specific type of on-site audits, we are working together with our partners, with our EDGE expert partners, to deliver these on-site audits if in case there is not a constant internet connection available.
Thanks, Harry. We've got one powerful question to end this webinar. So, after all we've learned, what will be the key selling point for EDGE for existing buildings for developers who don't care about zero emissions or efficiency or sustainability or green issues? The world is full of existing buildings and they're key for global success. So what is the key selling point? That is quite a powerful question. And I think from my side, there's two key selling points for existing buildings. One is that EDGE helps the owners of existing buildings really quantify the improvements, whether they are going for operational savings or saving the planet or whatever they're going for. Most existing buildings need improvements, need some level of refurbishment to meet changing national regulations. So EDGE's key selling point is being able to quantify those improvements, look at the incremental cost and the return on the investment, and do those refurbishments in a way that makes sense. For existing buildings on a larger scale, So touching more on what we've talked about today for existing portfolios of buildings, the key selling point is accessing finance to be able to do those refurbishments. That is absolutely the key selling point for portfolio scale. I don't know, Harry, if you have any other thoughts on this one. Harry?
Pardon, I didn't hear, the connection was gone for a second.
Oh, sorry. I was saying if you have any additional points on the key selling point for existing buildings going through Edge that for developers that do not care about zero emissions or efficiency or sustainability beyond financing and quantifying.
On the one hand, financing and quantifying, but also quicker sales of buildings, right? So if you can prove to the market that you have a sustainable buildings, even if you as a developer don't really care about sustainability, it will sell faster. Sometimes it even sells for a higher price.
Absolutely. And that's true for commercial and residential. And if you go to the edgebuildings.com website under the section for developers, IFC has actually gotten data from specific developers on how much quicker they have been able to sell projects around the world. So there actually is data proving this point as well.
And I think it all boils down to money, right? It's either getting money from financing or getting money faster from customers or saving money due to energy and water saving. Absolutely. If you don't care about zero carbon.
Absolutely. We are out of time. I think we've answered most of these questions. Thank you all so much for joining today. As mentioned, this has been recorded, so you will get a copy of the recording and the slides. And please do feel free to reach out to continue the conversation. We are happy to continue answering questions and have a discussion around implementing Edge at scale. So we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, and stay safe.